Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody, to Drug Science. David Nutt on medical psychedelics. Hi, David. So glad you could be with us today.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you.
So, just by way of brief introduction, although David Nutt is so well known, it'd be surprising if I tell anybody in the audience anything new. It is worth saying David Nutt is the chair and founder of Drug Science's Scientific Committee, and currently the Edmund J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and the head of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit at the Center for Academic Psychiatry in the Division of Brain Sciences, Department of Medicine, Hammersmith Hospital at Imperial College in London. He's also visiting professor at the Open University in the UK and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. David's published over 500 original research papers, similar number of reviews and books, book chapters, 8 government reports on drugs, and one for the general public, a great book called Drugs Without the Hot Air, which I recommend to all of you. David's held a lot of leadership positions across the UK and Europe in academic and scientific clinical organizations. And we're so honored to have you here today, David. I'm going to hand over to you, and we'll be taking questions at the end of David's session.
Thank you, Nem. It's really great to be here, and it's great to be talking on this topic, which, of course, is a very hot one, at least for me, because I'm spending a lot of my time researching it at Imperial. And drug science is also trying to pursue issues relating to the constrictions of research, which current scheduling situation with these drugs really makes quite difficult. So let me get my slides up and we will start. So when we talk about psychedelics, we're talking about a range of different compounds, some of which come from plants, such as mescaline from peyote cactus, some from mushrooms, psilocybin from one of the over 200 species of magic mushrooms, other from plants, ayahuasca, which is a liquid DMT concoction, which is brewed up in the Amazon using 2 plants, one to make the DMT and one to prevent the DMT being broken down. The European and Asian psychedelic of preference was Amanita muscaris, which is a different kind of psychedelic to these, which are serotonergic psychedelics. This has been used for many thousands of years. Here's a very useful guide to how to prepare them from a Roman mosaic. You get a pot of boiling water and throw in the mushrooms and you get your mushroom tea. Morning glory, the seeds of which contain an ergot derivative, as does ergot itself. So ergot is a fungus which grows on cereals. Here it's growing on rye. And the most important slide really is this one here. So this is a 3,000-year-old image on a vase of a Greek noble person partaking of ergot and alcohol. And some of you may know that the Greeks used to celebrate the arrival of the ergot on rye, which came in the autumn when a dew started to allow the fungus to grow. They didn't realize it was a fungus. They thought it was part of the plant. And they went out into the fields, gathered their ergot, drank their wine, and had what they called the mysteries, where they danced, they had performances, did poetry. And after a few weeks of those psychedelic-induced parties, psychedelic-supported parties, they then went back to the city-states, and they did what Greeks are really famous for, which is invent things like mathematics, geometry, many aspects of art. This is, you can see a remarkable piece of art in terms of ceramics. And of course, a political system, which we call democracy. And you can argue that psychedelics, through those mysteries and those experiences, may have been the foundation of the whole of what is now Western society. Well, let's fast forward now a few thousand years to the 1940s, when this man, Albert Hofmann, discovered LSD. He was working with ergot, and he made some molecular changes to the molecule and found a very profound effect. The drug is called LSD, of course. LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide. And what Hofmann did was add 2 extra, what we call chemical moieties, to the molecule, which made it much more potent and much more long-lasting. And he experienced it. It's his famous account of his accidental ingestion of LSD on the 19th of April. Was it's very, very well recounted, the alterations in perception of colors and time and music, etc. And he realized this was a landmark in terms of understanding brain function, a tool that could fundamentally change the brain, but not in the traditional way of opiates or sedatives, but which closed down the brain, but a drug which opened up the brain. And he used LSD, often in low to middle doses, quite regularly, right through his life. And here he is at 100. The first English doctor, or the first English scientist to try LSD, lived to 103. Because I think these are good examples of how psychedelics don't actually necessarily impair your long-term brain function. There is an interesting side to this, which is it maybe they do prolong it rather than impair it, but that's another story. And based on Hoffman's account of his experience and his persuasion, the company he worked for, Sandoz, made LSD available. They made it available here as tablets of LSD, and they also made it available here, psilocybin, magic mushroom juice, as tablets of psilocybin. And in fact, for a while, psilocybin was actually a medicine in some countries. And these psychedelics were used for a number of reasons. They were used to model psychosis, to develop an experimental platform on which he could study drugs which to understand the phenomenology, the altered consciousness of psychosis, but also to as a test bed for developing new drugs. And we're doing that today. Professor Mettle at King's College and me have done studies where we've looked at non-dopamine antipsychotics and shown that they do have an impact on the effects of psilocybin. And one of them now is going into trials as an antipsychotic. It was used widely in the 1950s by mental health professionals in a form of self-experimentation in order to understand the capacity of the brain to generate altered forms of understanding and beliefs and consciousness. And often it was given to young psychiatrists early in their training so that they might be more sympathetic to their patients who described altered experiences. It was a way of trying to improve empathy between patient and doctor. But mostly it was used in psychotherapy, and there were two forms of psychotherapy. There was what we call psychedelic psychotherapy, which is what we're doing today mostly. You give a pretty high dose, often just a single dose, which produces a powerful experience, often a mystical or peak experience, and from which people often come out feeling very different about their disorder. And that was the approach that was most favored in the US. In the UK, we used lower doses, what you might call a midi dose, not a microdose, but a dose that had clear psychological effects, which made people felt different, but they didn't hallucinate and they didn't go into the extremes of a psychedelic trip. And this low dose was used before each therapy. It was used to help people engage in psychotherapy, to break down these subconscious or unconscious resistances that many people have to dealing with their problems. In the UK, it was very much at the forefront of this field of research. And here are two UK psychiatry protagonists. This is Ronnie Lang, the famous anti-psychiatrist, but he was quite pro-psychoanalysis. He was also quite pro-psychedelics. And he said to people who wanted to become a psychoanalyst, they should do three things: read the works of Freud, undergo personal analysis, and take LSD. And Humphrey Osmond was a British psychiatrist who went to Canada. He was the man that actually gave Huxley LSD, started off, of course, using mescaline. And then he went to the States and ran a research center. And he said, to sink in hell or soar angelic, you'll need a pinch of psychedelic. And in the 1950s and 60s, there was an enormous amount of research that was conducted, particularly with LSD. Hundreds of psychiatrists were given access to it. The National Institute of Health in America funded up to 140 grants. They led to 1,000 clinical papers, 40,000 patients, 40 books, 6 international conferences. This was seen as the revolution. For the first time, science could help people with psychiatric problems. And in 1971, coincident with the United Nations ban, Masters and Houston put together this review. And overall, they described positive, safe, and effective outcomes with LSD and psilocybin. And there were a number of researchers who pulled together data from many, many sessions. I'm not going to go through all of these. But what was interesting about all these different assessments of different patient groups, two things are really important. The first is very low rates of suicide, probably lower than in the untreated population, certainly untreated psychiatric population. And rates of psychosis, which were very low also. So the idea that these drugs were very dangerous and likely to harm people was actually never seen in these kind of clinical analyses. And this is a quote which effectively sums up the clinical effectiveness of these drugs, or LSD anyway. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions. People can have odd trips, but they usually don't cause problems. But given adequate psychiatric supervision and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not great. But despite this wealth of positive data, these drugs got banned. And one of the few people that persevered using them in an underground session, treatment sessions, was this man, Stanislav Grof, who said this: psychedelics, used responsibly and with proper caution, would be for psychiatry what the microscope is for biology and medicine, or the telescope for astronomy. And many thousands of researchers in the 50s and 60s would agree with him. But they got banned. They were banned largely because of the Vietnam War and because they were seen as part of the anti-war movement. And many young Americans who were 18 could be called up to go and fight in Vietnam, an enemy they'd never see, for a cause they didn't understand, in a place they didn't want to be in. And some of them went to Canada and some went to San Francisco, and they took LSD, they listened to the Grateful Dead, they read the writings of Timothy Leary, put flowers in their hair, but most dangerous of all, they protested the war. And it's this particular placard that led to the banning of LSD. Drop acid, not bombs. And I can't help the feeling that that's a message we might well have continued to heed today. They didn't heed it then because the American way of international diplomacy was largely based on the atom or the hydrogen bomb, and also bombing Cambodia and Laos. But I often think maybe if we dropped acid rather than bombs in Syria, we might not have 7 million refugees, displaced people, undermining a great deal of what the stability of Europe. So that's just an interesting thought from an old man. What's more remarkable in many ways is the fact that LSD and other psychedelics got banned because LSD got banned. They were banned in the face of opposition from the most powerful man in the world at the time. Bobby Kennedy, Secretary of State, would have been president if he hadn't been assassinated. And he's confronting his bureaucrats, CIA, the FDA, Drug Enforcement Agency, who are saying, we've got to ban LSD. And he's saying, well, hang on. We spent billions of dollars on clinical LSD projects. They were worthwhile 6 months ago. Why aren't they worthwhile now? We keep going around and around. If I could get a flat answer about that, I'd be happy. Is there a misunderstanding about my question? He knew he was being lied to. He knew that people were trying to get these drugs banned for essentially dishonest reasons. And he went on to say, I think perhaps we've lost sight of the fact that LSD can be very, very helpful in our society if used properly. Not least because his wife was in LSD therapy at the time. And despite his power, he couldn't stop it. And this indicates one of the huge problems we have with the drug laws. Drug laws are very easy to make. Banning a drug is an easy thing to do. It can be done at the level of a bureaucrat. It can slip through governments with the assumption that, well, it won't do any harm if we ban something. Well, it might do some good. We don't care if it does any good, really, but we really don't want it to do any harm. But in fact, it turns out it does a lot of harm, and I'll talk about that now. And the harm it's done is the fact that this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world. And this is not just basic research, this is clinical research. Has there ever been a worse example of research censorship? Nope. Best I can come up with is 1616, when the Catholic Church banned the writings of Copernicus. Copernicus, in the middle here, he had worked out that the sun was the center of the universe, not the earth. And that conflicted with the Catholic Church's teachings at the time. So they banned his writings. They executed Giordano Bruno for teaching the Copernican view of the universe. And they gave Galileo a choice as well, recant or die. He sensibly recanted. Now that ban lasted nearly 150 years. The ban on psychedelics has lasted over 50 years. It's actually 60 years this year. And the ban on Copernicus only was enacted in Catholic countries. And so the Northern European Protestants could carry on looking at the skies with impunity. The ban on psychedelics has been endorsed by almost every single country in the United Nations. And actually, there weren't that many astronomers in those days, but there have been hundreds of thousands of neuroscientists and clinicians who've been denied access to these drugs in the last 60 years. And so the lost research opportunities are vastly greater for psychedelics than for the telescope. And here is proof that research was almost destroyed. So here you see number of papers per year in blue for LSD, in red for psilocybin. And they reached a peak here in 1968, just when the ban was being brought in America. And here's 1971, when the ban was brought in by the UN conventions. So this peak is the result of the vast investment by the US government in research, and to some extent by the British government too. Then after the ban, publications fall precipitously for two reasons. If you haven't got any money, you can't do research. And the US government has not funded a single research study with LSD in the last 60 years. It's just funded one over here with psilocybin just last week. And psilocybin almost disappeared. For 2 years, there were no publications at all on psilocybin. And the other reason why research died was that even if you could get money, say from philanthropists or other donors, getting hold of the drug was virtually impossible. The bureaucracy effectively blocked it. And this was a deliberate ploy. It was openly spoken about that eventually people would forget about psychedelics. They'd disappear. And it's all predicated on this hysteria that they might change the way people vote. If you want to read about the history, here's a review, a couple of reviews I've written. This one is a more general one. It covers cannabis as well. This one focuses on psychedelics. So about 15 years ago, I started fighting back, working with the Beckley Foundation. And we started off asking a simple question. Well, what is a psychedelic? What do psychedelics do in the brain? How can we define or understand the psychedelic state? And we started off working with psilocybin. This is a form of magic mushrooms which grows in the UK, Liberty Cap. And the active ingredient in psilocybin, in magic mushrooms, is psilocybin. And here's the affinity of psilocybin for these receptors. All the psychedelic drugs we're talking about today really are drugs which work on the serotonin 2A receptor. They stimulate the serotonin 2A receptor. And LSD has very high affinity, which is why you use micrograms. Psilocybin has lower affinity, which is why you use low milligram doses. And mescaline has even lower affinity, which is why you have to use high milligram doses. But for all these different drugs, the potency is determined by the affinity at this receptor. And that tells us categorically that these drugs all work through that receptor. Why did we use psilocybin? Well, 3 reasons. The first is that we knew by that time, about 2005, 2006, that about 1 million young people in Britain every year were using these mushrooms recreationally. They were using them just to experience the capacities of their brain. And there was almost no harm at all. So we can argue to the authorities, actually, that's pretty harmless drug. And the second reason we used it is that it's relatively short-lived. Now, in fact, we started off using it intravenously. And that was because we couldn't afford enough to buy it, enough to use it orally, because the intravenous dose is 10 times lower than the oral dose. We didn't have enough money to buy it orally, so we started off using it intravenously. And then it is very short-lived. It lasts about 30 minutes. And the third reason we work with psilocybin is that no politician or journalist knows how to spell it or say it. That's much less likely to be attacked. Everyone knows how to say LSD, and so working with LSD is just an open invitation to be assaulted by anti-drug campaigners. Now, these serotonin 2A receptors play a very particular role in brain function. We can image them. This is an image called a PET scan of these receptors in living human brain, and you see there's very high density of these receptors in the cortex, which is the most highly evolved part of your brain, and particularly this part of the cortex, and this part here, which is the most recently evolved part of the brain. And there's very low levels in the subcortical structure. So this is a receptor which is intimately involved and massively expressed in the parts of the brain which do the very high level, very human kinds of thinking, which is planning, imagining, reasoning, rationaling, learning. And this was our very first result. So we took volunteers, we put them in an MRI scanner, we gave them psilocybin intravenously. They had the full range of experiences. They had visual hallucinations. They had a sense of their ego dissolving. Many of them said that they felt as if they floated out of the scanner. One bowed at the foot of God. They all came back, which was good. And when we analyzed the data from their brains, we found something completely paradoxical. Because we'd imagined that the hallucinations would be associated with some increase in visual cortical activity, but they weren't. And what staggered us was that there was no increase anywhere. When you see a blue image or a blue marking on these kind of images, it tells you there's less activity. And we were absolutely staggered by this. We thought maybe we'd done the experiment wrong. You know, surely Timothy Leary couldn't be wrong. Surely these drugs turn on the brain, and our data was showing they turned off the brain. So we repeated the whole experiment using a different form of MRI. This is ASL, the arterial spin labeling. The next form we used was called blood oxygen level detection, BOLD. Gave me exactly the same results. And then we realized we discovered something pretty important. Now, these drugs are not turning on the brain. They're actually turning off the brain. But the parts of the brain they're turning off are very interesting, because they're the parts of the brain which regulate a lot of brain function. And one particular discovery we made, and this is why we moved into treating patients, was the fact that psilocybin dampened down this part of the brain inside the yellow circle, this part of the brain here. This is called the subgenual cingulate cortex, under the knee of the cortex. And this is an area which is really interesting in terms of depression, because multiple different treatments of depression, from antidepressant drugs like SSRIs, CBT, sleep deprivation, ECT, even placebo. If you get better on placebo, activity in this region goes down. This was remarkable. And we knew this literature, and it made us think, well, if we can dampen down this region immediately with psilocybin, many of these treatments take weeks to work. Maybe we could produce an immediate antidepressant effect. Because we now know that this part of the brain is the major driver for the generation of negative thoughts in depression. And the other reason we moved into treating patients was this discovery that a recently understood network of the brain called the default mode network was completely eliminated. It was wiped out by psilocybin. Now, you need to understand the default mode network, so I'm going to talk you through it quite carefully. It's called the default mode network because it's a circuit in the brain that is active when all the other brain circuits are switched off. So if you'd all like to close your eyes now, and when I stop talking, I want you to reflect on whether it was worth coming to this talk today, and what you might plan to do with the data you've learned so far later on. So just do that. Close your eyes, close your ears, and just think. Okay, you can open your eyes and ears again. Now, if I'd been scanning you in that situation of self-reflection, we'd show you scans like this. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. Red is hot. And these scans show areas of the brain which are working in synchrony. So this is a top-down view. This is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. And these 4 brain regions are working in synchrony when you're thinking about yourself. And that's why it's called the default mode network. If you started to move your arms and legs, these regions here would light up. If we saw things, these regions would light up. This network is the network which encodes your sense of self or your ego. And if you're a spiritual person, it almost certainly encodes your spiritual sense. And that's completely disrupted by psychedelics. And that is why psychedelics allow people to break away from particular problems in terms of thinking and behavior. We disrupt the circuit that drives that. And what's the evidence for that? Well, it's here. So about the same time we published our paper, this paper was published, and it's a rather elegant paper because it contrasts the extent of brain involvement in the default mode network in normal healthy controls with patients with major depressive disorder. And you can see here the patients have much more of their brain working in synchrony than the controls. And this creates several problems. The first problem it creates is there's not enough brain left to do other things like think or plan or read or concentrate. So this explains why depressed people have trouble with other executive type tasks. And the second thing is that this imaging study showed that the part of the brain, that this subgenual part of the brain was driving this communication. And you can see here the correlation between connectivity of the brain and rumination. And with reason then, well, maybe depression is a disorder where the brain is hyperconnective, the self-referential, the part of the brain, the default mode is continually over-engaged in this introspective, self-critical thinking. And if we could disrupt it, which we knew we could do with psychedelics, maybe we could disrupt these thinking processes and switch off the region that drives it all. One of the other reasons we moved into treating patients was because of the work of Roland Griffiths and Bill Richards here from Johns Hopkins. And they'd shown, just taking middle-aged people who were interested in understanding more about their mental capacities, they went into a single session, a single psychedelic psilocybin session, a 25 milligram dose, the same as we gave in our imaging studies, in a psychotherapeutic setting with guides here. And 2/3 of them said that this was one of the 5 most meaningful life experiences. And many of them had a sense of improved well-being, which lasted for very many years. And some of our subjects, even though they were getting the psilocybin in a brain scanner, said, well, I definitely feel better. I definitely feel more in touch with the world for a few weeks after the experience. And we wondered whether this was an antidepressant effect. So we went on and we did a study. And in 2012, we managed to get money from the Medical Research Council in Britain, the only time the government's ever funded any of this research. I think they funded it because depression is the major cause of disability in Britain today and most of the Western world. And it's a very difficult disorder to treat, and current treatments are not very good. So we were overjoyed. We made the breakthrough. We can study depression, test our hypothesis. The ethics committee took a different view. It took 3 goes before they would allow us to use psilocybin in depressed people. They said it was too dangerous. People might die. And we said that's pretty unlikely, and the MHRA said they won't. But in the end, we couldn't do a controlled trial. In the end, they said you have to do a safety study. You have to give it to 12 patients, and you have to see that they all survive 6 months. And if that's okay, then you can go on and do a controlled trial. So when I show you clinical data on the mood effects, that's the secondary data. The primary data was, did they live, did they die? And you'd be pleased to know. I'm not surprised to know, of course, that they all lived. But in a way, the ethics was easier. The drug supply took 30 months because this is an illegal drug under the UN conventions. It's almost no country in the world with a manufacturing capacity is it legal. I don't think any. So it took us a long time to find somewhere to get it made, and then we had all the problems with the import licenses, export licenses, etc. So it took 30 months to get this drug because this drug is deemed as extremely dangerous. And then another 2 months to get regulatory approvals. So 32 months out of a 36-month grant was spent just getting the approvals. And that's all because of the hysteria around magic mushrooms, which are treated. Magic mushrooms are in the same class of the Misuse of Drugs Act as crack cocaine and crystal meth, which is completely absurd, but that's extremely destructive to research because it costs about £1,500 a dose. And I had to have a special safe bolted to the wall of my room to store the psilocybin. And I said to the Home Office, well, why can't I just put it next to the heroin in the hospital pharmacy? They said, oh no, because heroin's a Schedule 2 drug and yours is a Schedule 1 drug. And I said, well, yeah, but if anyone breaks in, they're going to take the heroin, they're not going to take the psilocybin. Oh, no. Schedule 1 drugs. I mean, the whole mystique and mythology around these drugs is so over elaborated with lies and misinformation. It's just outrageous. Costs £1,500 a dose. Complete waste of money. But we did the study, and it was a very important study because it was a study in people with resistant depression. They had all failed on 2 drugs. Some had failed on 10 drugs. They'd all failed on CBT, and they all got better to some extent. Some of them got amazingly better. Some of them were cured below 5. They're cured, and some of them stayed well for months, and some are still well now. Look, some of these have gone out. Some are about 20%. 2 to 3 of them are well 6, 8, 10 years after the treatment. The effect size of going from pre-scores to after 1 week, 2 weeks, 5 weeks are huge. This is the biggest impact of any single treatment on resistant depression there has ever been. The big problem is for those people who got well and then who relapsed. How can we help them? So you've got this person here in the red bar. He did brilliantly, back to work, functioning beautifully, and then the depression started to creep back. And some of these up here who've done well to start with, look at that, it's a purple bar here, really well, and then slipping back. And these people can't have another dose because the drug's illegal. And they say to me, why can't you give it to me? And I say, because if I give it to you, I'll be breaking the law. The only way I'm allowed to give psilocybin is part of a clinical trial. If I don't have a clinical trial going on to study psilocybin in people who've had it and got worse again, then I can't use it. And they say, well, why can't you do that trial? And I say, because every grant I put into the MRC since, that's about 7 grants, has been turned down. And if you ask me why that is, I have no idea. One of the other most fascinating discoveries we made with our imaging data set was that when you give them to biomathematicians, this new kind of data, which they'd never had before, they come up with very interesting analyses. And these 2 images really do have become almost a sort of the emblem of research. Because on the left, you have connectivity in the brain in the normal state, on the right after psilocybin. And you see here, I should say each of these 2 images has exactly the same number of connections, 7,200. But here the connections are mostly around the edge. Visual cortex talks to visual cortex, auditory cortex to auditory cortex. Of course, there's got to be cross-cortical connections. If you see a bus running towards you, you've got to run, move your legs. But this is called the small world brain, and it's well recognized now that the brain is a very, very efficient computing machine. And it's very efficient because it doesn't waste energy talking across it. It does most of its work locally with just occasional incursions across the brain. Under psilocybin, connectivity is massively enhanced. That's because the control centers, the default mode has been broken down, so you can get much, much more connectivity. This is the kind of state your brain was in when you were a baby, when you were learning just about the whole nature of life and beginning to experience touch and see, sight and vision and smell, etc. And one theory of development is we take these brains, which have this almost complete capacity to communicate with everywhere, and prune them down and force them down into this very efficient network of thinking. And that, of course, that efficiency is very useful when you're talking about something like reading or writing or working out, how to use the London Tube map. But sometimes it goes wrong. Sometimes the restriction that the brain puts on thinking can go too far. The pendulum can swing too far in the direction of control. And that's why people get locked into disorders like depression and addiction, because their minds get so efficient at thinking these thoughts, which are useless, they can't break out of them. And we think psychedelics, well, we know psychedelics break the thinking up, and the increased connectivity. And this increased connectivity does two things. It can help you understand the nature of the problems that were driving your previous disorder, but also help you come up with new solutions to them. And if in this new connectivity, this new hyper-connected world, you can make connections which give you solutions, give you new ways of thinking and feeling and behaving, then you can stabilize those and learn those, because the serotonin 2A receptor is vital for encoding major conceptual changes in the way the brain works. And then you can set out on a new path, which is much less malignant than the old one. And here's an example of the changes we see. So we gave people a score which looked at their optimism, pessimism range. And depressed people score very low on optimism. They have what's called a pessimism bias. They see the world as a nasty, hostile, unpleasant place. And they're right. It certainly is. But understanding that doesn't help you. Most of us get by because we have what's called an optimism bias. We tend to see the good things in the world rather than the bad. And you can see that this pessimism bias is normalized in depressed people following successful treatment with psilocybin. They're not as optimistic as I would like, but at least they're not pessimistic. And here's a comment from one of our patients, which is published in this journal. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. Many of our patients describe this kind of effect. And I just want to say one thing about that. This understanding that it's pointless is often there at the beginning. But what psychedelics do is allow people to escape from the pointless thinking. Here's another quote. It was like when you defrag the hard drive on your computer. I experienced blocks going into place, things being rearranged in my mind. I visualized, as it all was put into order, a beautiful experience with those gold blocks going into black drawers that would illuminate. And I thought, my brain is being defragged. How brilliant is that? My mind works differently now. I ruminate much less, and my thoughts feel ordered, contextualized. Rumination was like thoughts out of context, out of time. Now my thoughts feel like they make sense, with context and logical flow. Many of our patients describe this analogy of computer defragging or reformatting to clear their mind so they can start again. And I just thought I'd share with you some of the criticisms that our patients made of their previous therapy, which is largely CBT. And they said things like this: CBT is too short. I'm sick to the back teeth of telling people again and again about the backstory. All the talking therapies, each time you go for an 8 or 6 week course, you spend the first few weeks going over the stuff. They ask you all the questions again. Then it's session 4. And then you think, who's learning something here? Because I'm not. You are. Too directive. They all seem to be trying to fit a person into a preconceived set of patterns. Try to do this, make this your goal, and we'll measure it. But just having those goals set for you is more pressure. And when you don't meet those goals, you feel even worse because you're letting them down and you already feel let down yourself. And also they say they don't address the trauma. Many people's depressions and PTSD have been driven by trauma, and CBT doesn't really address that. I want to tell you now about this new study we've recently done which was a second psilocybin trial, Psilodept 2. And this was a comparison of psilocybin with one of the gold standard antidepressants called escitalopram. And it's a very difficult study to do and conceive, but we came up with a design where everyone got psilocybin, but some people got a low dose, a 1 milligram dose, what you might call a placebo dose, and then they went on to the escitalopram for 6 weeks. Whereas the other group got a high dose, 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, and they went on placebo for 2 weeks, or 6 weeks, sorry. And there were 2 doses of psilocybin for each group. So all the procedures were the same, or the psychotherapy was the same. The only difference is that one group got a low dose placebo and escitalopram, and the other got high dose placebo, a high dose of psilocybin and placebo. Just looking at the outcomes, we were interested in side effects. And overall, there was very little difference in terms of side effects. Slightly less anxiety and dry mouth with psilocybin, but overall, both well tolerated. What about the efficacy measures? Well, we had efficacy measures in terms of the Hamilton, these 4 scales here, and you see 3 out of those 4 scales significantly favored psilocybin. If these error bars are less than the dotted line, then it's a green bar, and that tells you it's significant. There was less avoidance, less anhedonia, better work and social functioning, better flourishing, much reduced anxiety, improved well-being, etc. So on almost every measure, psilocybin beat escitalopram. And these are particularly interesting graphs because they show the time course. You say after the first dose, 2 weeks after the first dose, measures of well-being were over twice that for psilocybin than they were for escitalopram. And measures of reduction in depressive symptoms were greater for psilocybin than escitalopram. And overall, this is a very significant improvement, better improvement with psilocybin than escitalopram. Now, we're not the only people working in this field, as you probably know. There have been 2 very good studies looking at psychedelics, psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety and depression, conducted at Johns Hopkins and New York University. And this is a very recent study published again this year from the Johns Hopkins group. And what they did here was take people with depression and take half of them and give them psilocybin, and the other half they just waited. You can see that this group that got psilocybin had much better outcome. And when they took these delayed ones and gave them psilocybin, they get better too. But also, there's data on using psilocybin to deal with smoking and alcoholism. And currently there are trials going on in resistant depression, anorexia, OCD, and pain syndromes. And in Latin America and also in in Spain, there's some studies going on with ayahuasca for depression. Now you might say, what have addictions and depression and anxiety got to do together? And the answer is, I think they're all what we call internalizing disorders. They're all disorders in which people get locked into maladaptive thoughts, which they find unhelpful and destructive, but they can't escape from them. And I think the perturbation of brain activity, which leads to insights into them and new ways of thinking about them, explains why psychedelics could have such a broad remit. Let me just show you some of the data from those 2 psilocybin addiction studies. So this one on the left is the smoking one, this one on the right is the alcohol one. And what was remarkable in the tobacco quitting study was that 15 out of the 18 people completely stopped smoking. I mean, an enormously powerful effect, more powerful than anything ever been shown in terms of stopping smoking before. And Matt Johnson, who ran the study, says, what's interesting about it is that when you talk to people, why don't they want to smoke? They just say, I don't want to smoke anymore. I don't have any relationship with smoking that I used to have. And before, of course, they were craving and in a habit of taking cigarettes every day. And here is the bog and shoot study with alcohol. Here's the first dose of psilocybin, and it produced a profound reduction in drinking behavior, which persisted after the second dose. And that perhaps isn't surprising when you go back in history, and you go back and you look at the 1960s. Now in the 1960s, it's not generally known that one of the great protagonists, the campaigners for psychedelic therapy, was Bill Wilson, who founded Alcoholics Anonymous. And he escaped from his alcoholism through a psychedelic trip. And he was the person that actually gave LSD to Huxley. And he became a total advocate for the use of psychedelics to help alcoholics see that there's more to life, there can be more to life than the bottle. And he encouraged the National Institutes of Health in America to do 6 trials of LSD and alcoholism. And recently, these 2 Norwegians analyzed the data, and they come up with a analysis which shows that just 1 or 2 doses of LSD have an effect size that is twice that, more than twice that actually, of best current therapy. Now I've done a simple calculation. If you go back to 1971, the convention. So what is that? That's 50 years of a ban. In that time, probably 100 million people will have died prematurely from smoking. Sorry, from alcoholism, sorry. So, and more would have died from smoking, probably twice as many from smoking. If we hadn't banned LSD and we carried on rolling it out with the same efficacy as those trials showed, or even less efficacy, let's just say it only helped 10%. It was likely to help more than like 40, but let's say it only helped 10%. That would be 10 million lives saved. Then you have to ask the question, well, I wonder how many lives have been saved by the ban? And the answer is probably none, because I'm not sure use has gone down. But let's say it did affect, let's say it deterred some people. Maybe it saved 100 lives a year. Yeah, maybe that's 5,000 lives saved. Maybe. So you've got 5,000 lives saved, you've got 10 million lives lost. The equation is utterly, utterly disproportionate. So this politically motivated ban on LSD has done nothing but essentially condemn millions of people to an unsatisfactory outcome from taking drugs like alcohol. And it's, as I say, it's the worst censorship of research in 2 ways. It's not just the most extreme, but it's also worst in terms of outcomes. Okay, if you want to read more about what I've said, there's a little review in this journal called Cell. It takes you from the individual neurons and how the brain activity changes and how that reorganizes brain thinking. So if you want to read more about that, go to this review. There are some interesting questions we're still trying to resolve, but I haven't got time to talk about those today. I want now to move to the other sort of psychedelic. It's not really a psychedelic, but it's often called that. But it's definitely an illegal drug. It's a banned drug, and it's called MDMA. And this has also been resurrected by my group and others as a treatment. This is the man called Sasha Shulgin, who made MDMA back in the 1970s and realized that it was actually a very interesting drug, very different from all the amphetamines he'd made before. And this is his wife. And he, having uncovered the remarkable empathogenic properties of MDMA, he gave it to his wife and she said, "This is remarkable. This will be really useful for couples counseling. It'll help people fall back in love, break down the barriers and incrustation, the collection, the hostility that encrusts a marriage often." And it was widely used and it was seen as a major breakthrough. But then, of course, it was a legal drug and unscrupulous club owners started allowing it to be sold or selling it in their clubs to allow people to dance and have more fun with each other. The worst thing was that they changed the name. It used to be called Empathy, then they changed it to Ecstasy. Ecstasy made it much more appealing to young people, but it also made it much more irritating to the media, who immediately campaigned to get it banned. And they did, they succeeded in getting it banned. But this organization called MAPS, Nick Doblin's organization, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, they knew it was a very effective drug. And over the last 30 years, they have been pioneering research funded by charities to prove its therapeutic utility. And they've just recently published a phase 3 study in PTSD, where it's proved to be very effective. And if you are interested in how it works, there's a recent review that I wrote with Harriet DeWitt. And MDMA works in a very special way to dampen down emotional memories. We know that the problem with PTSD is not the memory. You can never forget the fact you've had your leg blown off by a bomb, but the fact that every time a car goes off, your brain thinks you're being blown up again. So the emotional response to stimuli, which are like the original trauma, cause massive activation of emotions, which are completely disruptive. If you think you're being blown up every time a door slams, you can't live much of a life. And MDMA works in the brain to dampen down that emotional memory and allow people to engage in therapy to overcome it. And just this year, we published results of the first study using MDMA to treat alcoholism. And we did that, my colleague Ben Sessa led this, because he was a child psychiatrist until he became an addiction psychiatrist. And he realized that the children he was seeing in child psychiatry, that he was looking after and nurturing, who were being disadvantaged and abused, were turning into addicts when they became older. And at that point, no one was trying to help them. People were just blaming them. And he said, well, maybe if we could help them deal with the trauma from their childhood, maybe then they can cope better without having to turn to drink. So we did this study, which is basically an abstinence-based study, a standard program. Goes on for what? How long does it go on for? It goes on for 6 to 8 weeks. And there are 2 therapy sessions in it, 2 MDMA therapy sessions, 100 milligrams and 20 milligrams top up. And the results were remarkable. And the first thing to say was it's perfectly safe. The second thing to say was it actually reduced mood, depressed symptoms, it improved mood. Depressive symptoms went down after the MDMA. They didn't go up like people predicted with the sort of Blue Mondays idea. But it had a remarkable effect on people's drinking. So here you see the percentage of people drinking above the recommended limits before they enter is obviously 100 because they're all alcoholics. And here you see the black line is after the 2 sessions of MDMA therapy here. You see that over 6 months, certainly 3/4, on average, 3/4 reduce their consumption to less than the recommended limit. So that's fantastic, because this is what happens in the real world. So this is exactly the same group, the same therapy in the same place with the same therapist. But here, they don't get MDMA. And you can see here 3/4 relapse within 6 months. So this is a profoundly powerful effect of MDMA reducing relapse rates in alcoholism. And actually thinking about psychedelics for alcoholism, we've known previously, there's definite evidence from Evgeny Krupitsky in Russia, who has discovered that ketamine can, which is a kind of psychedelic, can help his heroin and alcohol addicts reduce their use. And this has led to more Western research. A couple of studies come out of New York. This is a study looking at cocaine use, showing that ketamine treatment reduces subsequent cocaine use compared with the control. The control is midazolam. They give people a sedative benzo to try to mimic the altered state of consciousness of ketamine. You can't do that exactly, but it's a useful kind of positive control. And the same group have done the same. The same group have done it with alcoholism, showing much better outcomes in terms of heavy drinking days following ketamine followed than midazolam. And there's a study from Celia Morgan in Exeter will be published, I think, early next year, looking at ketamine and mindfulness training in alcoholism, showing again a very powerful benefit of ketamine to promote good outcomes. So it's like, there's growing interest now in psychedelics in relation to treating addiction. I just want to finish now by just explaining to you just how these drugs work at the neuroscience level. So the first thing you have to understand is that the brain isn't a simple receptacle for what's going on out there. If we just take vision as an example, your brain isn't a camera. It doesn't take lots of pictures of what's going on out there. What happens is that the light, the photons from the light go into the retina. The retina turns them into a whole series of different electrical impulses that tell the color and the movement and the place. These go up the optic nerve into the back part of the brain. And in the back part of the brain, these different components of the visual scene are reconstructed. And in fact, what you see is a reconstruction of what the brain thinks is out there. And largely, the brain is pretty efficient. You know, you've been watching me for the last hour. Your brain worked out within the first second that I'm me. And if I'd turned into a tiger, you probably wouldn't have noticed. Unless something dramatic changes, your brain's not interested because it makes predictions. And that's why it's a very, very efficient computer. But sometimes the brain constructs things it wants to see, not what it expects to see. And to explain this, I want to drop back in time to the writings of William Blake. Now, Blake was a great visionary artist and philosopher and painter. He wrote the words to the song Jerusalem, the English national anthem. And as an artist, he could see things rather differently from other people. And he said this: man always sees things with limitations. Man sees through the chinks of his cavern, as if men, when they look out, they can't see the whole world. They can just see a little bit of world. And he's right. The brain constrains what they see to what's necessary and important to optimize life and survival. For most of us, of course, even though we don't see the whole picture, we do see something that's relatively pleasant. We see blue sky and white clouds. But for some of us, some of our patients, when they look out, they don't see blue sky. They just see a grey, miserable, rainy world, and they're depressed. And when our addicts look out, what do they see? They see their love objects. They see the bottle or signs of the bottle or the syringe or the powder. And this is beautifully summed up by another quote from Blake. Blake talks about the human's mind-forged manacles, the way the human mind has constrained itself so that it can't escape. It does things it doesn't want to do. It certainly shouldn't do, but it can't escape from. Now, the only thing I can say is he's wrong. In many cases, it's brain-forged. Sometimes they're mind-forged manacles, sometimes they're brain-forged manacles. And they often start with the mind and move to the brain and become habits. But the point is that psychedelics can break these manacles because they disrupt this process of constructing them and repeatedly reliving them. And I'll finish now with this quote from another philosopher and writer, George Bernard Shaw. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And what I've shown you is psychedelic treatments can change the minds of our patients in a very dramatic and useful way. And I hope this research can change the minds of the public and politicians about psychedelics and bring them back into medical practice, because there's no question our patients both need them and deserve them. So thank you very much. I'll acknowledge the people that supported this work, and I will take questions. Thank you.
Wow, David, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very well. Yeah.
Great. So I think, for this festival, we conceived of the themes of justice, science, and pleasure. We've had some fantastic conversations around pleasure and benefit, particularly from the perspective of people using the substances. So I think it's a perfect kind of conclusion to so many of these discussions that you've taken us to the science demonstrating the benefit of controlled substances, specifically psychedelics. And how you spoke about empathy too, I think that's really interesting, and we should come back to that. But I do recognize there has been an extraordinary amount of chat, lots of questions during your talk. So let's, if the Constellations team could help me track right back to Jada's first question, a question from Jada Girelli. Jada asks, where else in Europe is this research happening? And is there any chance that psilocybin therapy will be approved for treatment for depression anytime soon, or what sort of time frame are we looking at for that, do you think?
Sure. I know there's very little research in terms of the brain mechanisms or clinical research going on with psilocybin or LSD or DMT, other than in our centre, and some clinical work going on at King's College. There's quite a bit of research was going on in Barcelona with ayahuasca. In terms of clinical rollout, there has been, however, a very successful replication of our resistant depression study done by a company called Compass Pathways. And they published their headline results just last week. And they showed a very similar profile to us, that a 25 milligram dose was, significantly powerful in treating resistant depression, people who'd failed on other treatments, whereas a 1 milligram and a 10 milligram dose didn't. So now I'm telling you that for two reasons. The first is that that's on the regulatory pathway. That will now lead to them doing a phase 3 study. And as they've got fast accelerated status and breakthrough status with the FDA, if one high quality phase 3 study could be enough to get the drug license. So maybe within 3 years, psilocybin could be licensed. The other reason for telling you that is that study was conducted in 12 countries, 7 or so, each of which were in Europe. So there's definitely clinical research as part of these multi-center trials going on in Europe.
Oh, that's interesting. I think it's particularly powerful, and you kind of touched upon this in your presentation as well, given how stigmatized and marginalized and excluded kind of drugs are. I think it's really powerful if we can demonstrate the kind of the benefit of controlled substances and psychedelics to an issue or to a mainstream group of the population. And since so many people experience depression, PTSD and veterans with the MAPS work in the States, I think it's so valuable that we have this, that we can offer and say, please rethink this. We're getting it so wrong that we're not doing the research into psychedelics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned ayahuasca, and there's a question from Jay Walker about ibogaine and ayahuasca, I think up the top of the chat as well. Can ibogaine and ayahuasca, when consumed under the right guidance, be a quicker way to help people break out of addictive loops?
It won't be any quicker. I mean, ayahuasca works about the same time course as psilocybin. In both cases, we're looking at an almost immediate, the day after, people are better. But we can actually magnify that improvement with psychotherapy too. So let's just emphasize it's a combination of drug and psychotherapy that we always use. Either alone might be useful, but together they're very, very powerful. Ibogaine, I don't know. Ibogaine is a challenging drug to work with. It's largely been limited to treating people with heroin addiction. It's quite a difficult drug to use. It has quite a lot of cardiac effects. We're in the process of trying to tee up to do a neuroimaging study to actually find out whether it is a psychedelic in the brain like other psychedelics. Clearly, the experience isn't similar to ayahuasca or to psilocybin, and the effects are often very enduring. So it's, I think that's going to be rather limited, probably to specialist retreats rather than conventional medicine. I think it might come through for addiction in some time in the future, but it's definitely behind the others at present.
Sorry, I missed a word you said. You said that ibogaine has particular types of effects.
It's cardiac. The problem with ibogaine is if you push the dose up, you get cardiac conduction problems. And there have been 34 deaths worldwide on ibogaine treatment, which is quite a lot of deaths compared with any other psychedelic.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So there's a few more questions coming in. I think there's one from Nick Shaw halfway through the chat there. Yeah. You see that, David? Evidence as to whether THC enhances or inhibits different psychedelics?
Yes, I'm just smiling because there is a paper of ours which has just been accepted for publication just a couple of weeks ago. Not science, but taking evidence from people who were using both together, and it can do both. It probably generally for the majority enhances, but in some people it can not. And no, we don't know anything about specific. I don't think we know anything about no specific indicate or effect on any particular psychedelic.
Yeah. Has any of your research gone into the interactions between different psychedelics with each other?
No, that's enormously complicated to do. It's a very easy question and an extremely difficult experiment.
I'm just picturing 5 safes in your office, each of them cemented to the floor as required by the Home Office.
Yeah. But then you also get into multiple problems with kinetics. What dose to use of each and what timing. It's truly those experiments will probably never be done, Naomi. So unless you have a really compelling reason and a lot of money, then you're not going to get them.
The thing that made me ask it is that I think with most kind of younger people using drugs these days, polydrug use is so prevalent. Obviously, we're talking about a medical context for you, but I think in everyday street purchase drugs, it's really very much about kind of mixing and adapting your doses.
Yeah, well, all I can say is, yes, absolutely, and we should collect information, self-report information on that, absolutely. But if I just say, just a word of caution: if you're going to mix drugs, then mix smaller amounts of each.
Thank you, David.
Top of that,
you heard it here, guys. Professor Nutt takes a harm reduction approach. Dose a little at a time. So next, we've got a question from Ruth Goldsmith. Thanks, guys. Constellations there. As someone who uses escitalopram, I'm so sorry about that, on a daily basis, I was fascinated by the study comparing psilocybin and this medicine. I'll be looking it up. Don't worry, I won't immediately drop the tablets, but I'm interested to understand more about how psilocybin may be considered preferable from the standpoint of side effects, efficacy, and also being a substance found in nature.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ruth. So there are several ways I could answer that question. As a clinician, and obviously I don't know you, but in general, as a clinician, if someone's doing well on a drug, I wouldn't change it, because I have seen, in my 4 decades of clinical practice, people, often doctors, think they know better, stop a drug, stop their antidepressant, go into depression, never recover. So there's always a risk of stopping a drug that's working. So the reasons for stopping medication, the only reason for stopping a medication that's working is that the side effects are unbearable. Now, if that were the case, then yes, slowly stopping escitalopram under medical supervision to consider going on into having a trial of psilocybin would make sense if you could get access to psilocybin. And very interestingly, I had a psychiatrist write to me this morning about a patient that just wants to do that with exactly the same drug, escitalopram. My advice was, only the patient can decide, and they've got to know the risks. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is there is absolutely no point in taking psilocybin on top of escitalopram, because our experience is that if you've been on escitalopram for more than a few weeks, the effects are blunted. So that's the problem. Now, you can augment escitalopram with ketamine. And ketamine is actually licensed as an add-on rather than an alternative. So if you weren't getting adequate responses from escitalopram, you could add on ketamine. But then the other side of the coin, of course, is whether you prefer to be sort of cured with a single dose of psilocybin or carry on taking escitalopram all your life. And a lot of people would prefer that. A lot of people also take your view that maybe a natural product might have some kind of benefits, whether they're scientific or spiritual or whatever. So yes, I certainly wouldn't. I think you should go and research it and then come to a sensible decision, because it is conceivable that you could have a good experience with psilocybin and then not need escitalopram subsequently. But again, I would emphasize, in our work so far, only a minority stay well for long periods. The people who do well, the people that have survived and with depression free for years, are the ones whose depression was caused by really a single major disruptor to their life, which they can reframe and overcome. People whose depression seems to have come about as a consequence of many years, often of trauma, often from childhood, then it does seem in those cases that the depression is going to rather set in the brain. The brain's almost set in a depressive mold, and that's harder to break with just a single trip.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Constellations team, if I can just segue before I hit the next question, I'm really interested to see this comment from Sarah Gomez, just because David's presentation was so beautiful in its mixture of literature and philosophy and drugs. There's a very interesting collection of essays, Sarah Gomez says, by Claudia Naranjo, called Healing the Minds to Change the World. You heard of these, David?
Yes. Yeah. There is some dispute as to the veracity, but they're definitely compelling. Yes. Carry on. Yeah, I don't find anything to dispute about the I mean, whether it's true or not is an interesting thing, but I think some. Anyway, let's move on. They're
Fantastic.
definitely, but there's no question. There are traditional use of ayahuasca in Latin America is associated with powerful and effective outcomes. Yes.
Brilliant, brilliant. Just in the nature of recognizing all the different systems of knowledge, I'm really happy to hear another one from Sarah as well. So next, we've got a question from Doc Clack, also on the line of worldviews. If philosophers have been interpreting the world and proletariats changing it, is then the next democratic leap forward reinterpreting our minds? Big questions here.
Absolutely, totally. Yeah. That's why, and that is, of course, why these drugs were banned in the 60s, because politicians realized that these drugs were changing people's minds and they weren't going to vote particularly for Republicans.
Powerful challenges to have. Wonderful. And we've got a question from Vincent Hesse. Why do you think, why do we think that some people have negative effects using psychedelics?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, and I wish I could answer it. So, in our research, we have had relatively few negative effects. What we have had, we've had anxiety in some people, and that is, of course, actually that was the only negative predictor of poor outcomes in the first trial. I haven't yet looked at it in the second trial. And anxiety about losing your mind is obviously an anxiety that many people have when they first take psychedelics. So if we can calm that anxiety down, and we work very hard to reassure people that this won't happen, they won't go mad. And there's always a guide. In fact, we always have 2 guides with them throughout the therapy session. So anxiety is the biggest predictor of a bad trip. But again, even a bad trip doesn't necessarily lead to bad outcomes. And, we had one guy in our LSD study, which was an imaging study here. He got very anxious. He got out the scanner. He was really very disturbed about what was going on. But afterwards, he wrote about it, and he said, "Yeah. It gave me insights. It told me I shouldn't have been scared, and it also made me think differently about the world." So bad trips can be therapeutic, even though they're not pleasant. And I also should say that our depressed people, most of them don't have fun. Most of them go to places they have been avoiding going to for a very long time. They go back to where the trauma came from, and it isn't fun to do that. And it's the same with MDMA. The MDMA is really, really hard work, because in the MDMA you're kind of forced to go back. That's the therapy is slightly different. With psychedelics, there's no guiding. The therapists aren't helping you go anywhere, but with MDMA they are. They're actually taking you back to the trauma so you can overcome the trauma. There's this great quote from an American vet who was part of the early MAPS studies, who said, after 7 hours of wrestling with his emotions and his memories, he said, "I don't know why they call this ecstasy, because it's agony."
Oh God. Just a quick clarifying point there. This point you're making on anxiety having some sort of interplay with your experience during a trip. Do you mean like a sense of a generalized anxiety that a person's experiencing, or their anxiety specifically in relation to the trip before they take the substance?
I think very anxious people, our experience is they don't want a trip. I mean, in fact, this has come to the fore when we're starting a study in people with OCD, who, of course, are very concerned about losing control. And they have told us, our patient experts have told us, we will not have a trip. We will not take a dose. So now we're losing a lower dose in them to see if we can move them a little way so that maybe eventually they will. But yeah, anxiety it stops people having the experience. And actually, that's an important point generally for the generation of sort of 25 plussers. Most of them are terrified of psychedelics because they've been told that they're really dangerous drugs and they lose their mind. So actually, rolling out this clinically is not going to be straightforward, because we have to do a lot of education. There are quite a lot of people there who, even if they would benefit, would certainly not want it.
Yeah, I can't imagine the COVID pandemic's been particularly helpful in addressing generalized anxiety and people's experience with it either. So I want to take just one last question, David, because I realize that we're pushing the edge of our time zone, but we've got a great broad question from Valerie Schumann just come in, and we can wrap up with that. What do you think about communal versus individual healing experiences with psychedelics? a very Western approach of focusing on the individual and brain chemistry seems to have limitations in terms of the human need for connection and hopeful outcomes for social change. And obviously, everybody here is very invested in hopeful outcomes for social change.
Yeah. Well, indeed, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that doing it as a group could be both safe and effective. I think there is some anecdotal evidence it may be more effective in a group than individually, and that comes from my talking to veterans, many of whom have gone off and done ayahuasca or psilocybin with their colleagues, and then that makes perfect sense to me. You get traumatized as a platoon. You lose a couple of your mates who get blown up, and you're carrying the image of that trauma with you all your life, and then you go with the remains of your platoon. You get back together, and you heal yourself together. So I think groups of people who've potentially been through the same kind of trauma, with the same problems, could be more powerful than individual therapy. I think I'm not so sure about mixing disorders and diagnoses. I'm not totally sure about mixing genders. I mean, I think there are some challenges there, but I think we should have a very open mind, because of course it's also potentially much more cost effective. So I think it's an area where I'd like to see some serious research done. But I would also say, in general, most people prefer one-on-one. And group therapy was something that was widely encouraged when I started training in psychiatry. It was a kind of de rigueur, but now groups can be traumatizing as well as healing. So and a badly managed group can be quite a difficult place to be. So So I don't think groups will always be the only way, but I think there's certainly the times when they could be the best way, but for special subgroups of patients.
Yeah. That is a great question to end our session today with. David, this has just been so fantastic. It's such an honor to have you here with us at Constellations. Everybody, the recording will be available on the platform if you want to go back and scrutinize David's slides and really understand how the UN conventions did destroy research into psychedelics. David, we wish you all the best. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to talk to you guys. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.